Good afternoon, everyone, and nice to see you all again. Congratulations on your story, and congratulations to the coach for publishing. I'm really pleased that I've been asked to moderate this panel. The title is Indigenous Literary Journalism, a Global Exploration, and one of the reasons I'm pleased to have been asked to moderate this panel, I don't know if the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has come up today. I mean, everyone from Canada would know about it, but from our friends from other countries, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established to inquire into the residential schools that existed in this country for a century. Their explicit purpose was to dispossess Indigenous people of their culture, their language, their identity, and their effect was to impose upon generations of Indigenous children sexual, physical, emotional, and spiritual abuse. So the country has been through a very significant process looking into that terrible history in the context of the broader history of relations between the Crown, between Canada and its Indigenous people. And it came out with 94 calls to action, and one of them is very relevant to this topic. It's Call to Action 86, and it's very important to us here at King's. It must be very important to us here at King's because it calls upon Canadian journalism programs and media schools to require education for all students on the history of Aboriginal peoples, including the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and Aboriginal-Crown relations. We have a long way to go at this university to respond to that call to action, but I think this panel is very, very important in that respect. I'm going to, so it says that I'm supposed to briefly introduce each of the speakers. Is that the format that we use? Okay. So Pablo Calvi, is that pronounced correctly? Will speak to us on the topic of Between Ethnography, Myth, and Journalism, reporting on the creation of a Sápara Bible. John Coward will speak to us on the topic of Writing from the Indigenous Edge, Journeys into the Native American Experience. Jennifer Martin is speaking on the topic Writing Aboriginality, a case study examining how Indigenous people have been portrayed in the winning feature entries for Australia's top journalism prize, the Walkley Awards. Duncan McCue, I haven't given other people's affiliation, but I can't resist. Duncan is a graduate of King's University. Will speak to us on Indigenous Memoir and literary journalism, a personal story. And Bill Reynolds will speak to us on the topic Dan David and the political force of Indigenous literary journalism. So, Pablo, I think you're starting us off, and I have a device here that's going to time 12 minutes. Off you go. Thank you.
Thank you for having us here, and I think that this is a very important topic to be discussing today. I'm going to be talking about the Sápara of Ecuador, a nation, one amongst the some 400 and some nations in Latin America that have been basically pretty much obliterated after the conquest, the Spanish and Portuguese conquest. The Sápara culture is mainly oral. In 1999, UNESCO declared it intangible heritage of mankind. So their leaders got hold of a couple $100,000, and they hired a linguist to turn in a grammar for the language, so they hadn't studied the language. an articulated grammar, and it was the first time that they could actually see their language written. And when they got this first step into registering part of their culture, one of the leaders, Manari, asked that he started with his brother to actually document all their creation myths. And since I had written a piece on them for The Believer, and I had reported on the Sápara struggle against the China National Petroleum Corporation in Ecuador, and I became friends with Manari over the 4 months I was reporting with them there in the jungle. He asked me to get involved in the writing of the Bible. Now, I have never written a Bible, and I'm assuming that a few people here, well, with the exception of Norm, perhaps, we're not familiar with the process, right? And my background is in journalism, long form, and daily journalism, so I was not familiar with the process. And the request and the entire dynamic of producing this object, which is still in the making, put into question a number of things that I had already assumed, and made me think. I mean, I'm going to go to the conclusions right away, and then I'm going to give you a trace back on why I think I reached, to a certain extent, that conclusion. I think that there's some elements about the current model of journalism and narrative journalism that cannot be applied to writing about indigenous issues, and they are obsolete, and we should change the entire matrix through which we approach those issues. But let me show you. Let me tell you what are the first things that I came into starting to question. Right, the first one was my definition of journalism reporting. The second one was what was the role of journalism and literary journalism in Latin America today. My idea about Latin America, I had started thinking that Latin America was like a cluster of nations that spoke Spanish mainly and Portuguese, and you see that underneath the network of nations who speak those languages, there are other nations who have been there before and speak other languages and report on their cultures in a different way. Right? So there's an underlying pre-existent Latin America that we rarely talk about. And that brought into question the notion of how to create an authentic Latin American narrative, and consequently Latin American narrative journalism. So there were several problems that I had started to deal. I had to start dealing right away. The first one is the notion of the letter scribe, which is like those nations which are mainly oral, or their traditions stay in an oral state. The notion of bringing those traditions into scripture and transposing the orality into written form generates a certain creates immediate tension, right? Now that overlaps with something that I mentioned that I think of as an extractive matrix, right? Of Western culture. Since Pizarro set foot in Peru until now, these native cultures have been dealing with the West trying to extract something off of, right? Being what we call natural resources, land, but there's always an extractive pattern to our approach to native cultures. In general, the approach that many of these Aboriginal or indigenous cultures have to nature is not instrumental. When I'm dealing with the Sápara, when I'm dealing with the Quechua, they treat nature, Pachamama, or multiple different iterations of that same concept, as also a subject, not an object, on equal footing, on equal grounding with humans, right, and animals. So there's a different idea upon which these cultures are operating, and they never treat natural resources as inherent. Right? There's always an interaction and a dialogue between certain cultures, in particular the Sápara and nature. There's a dialogical approach to nature. But there's also a dialogical approach to narrative and the construction of narratives, right? And that made me think that when I went there as a journalist, I was applying the same extractive metrics, right? I was going there to extract the story from it. And I had to catch myself every time I was intending to do that, because I thought, well, that is part of the same ethos. Right? I'm coming from that same point of view, taking something away and appropriating it. So that was the first problem that I had when Ari asked me to collaborate writing that Bible. I did not want to be extractive in my approach. So when you treat nature as a collaborator, when those narratives involve nature as a collaborator, you need to start thinking of who are the characters in the narratives. And there's problems there right away. One of the difficulties is like, how do I treat nature as a character? How do I treat a river as a character, or a tree as a character? Right? So those are very concrete narrative problems that you're faced when you are dealing with these types of narratives that are not subject centric narratives. And this has to do, I think, with Western narratives. Like the pattern of Western narrative is usually subject centric. Nature is usually treated as an object. Even in Romanticism, we have this same approach. So I started feeling kind of a little bit of a sense of disgust about my own profession, not in a Jen and Malcolm sense of betrayal, but more in a sense in which, like, the metrics that I was raised with and I was using to approach the subject was not conducive to portraying these ideas and getting these ideas in good shape. The other immediate problem that I faced was the problem of the narrator, right? A biblical narrator, Chris Berry, says that has two main characteristics: it's omniscient and obtrusive, right? So he knows everything, she knows everything, and he's everywhere. But these types of narratives have a different angle, they have a different approach, they're not obtrusive, for instance, which is something that was surprising to me. And sometimes I collect it, like if you read the Popol Vuh, I had to go into many creative myths in order to actually see how to produce a report about it. And those are collective narratives, so they're different. I thought of testimonial narrative, but testimonial narrative has the same problem, right? It's extractive, and sometimes it doesn't consider it filters the narrative through the Western patterns and structures. So I think that the clearest and the easiest way to revamp journalistic narratives vis-a-vis Native American cultures, I thought, was to try to approach them not from, I was using Habermas here, not from a point of view of instrumental rationality, but trying to follow what Habermas calls a communicative rationality, right? An approach that has to do with empathy and dialogue, setting common goals, which is something that we rarely do when we go on report with our subjects, right? We just go and talk to them, and then there's no dialogue, and I'm not going to show you what I wrote. I'm just going to publish it, and then you like it, you like it, you don't like it, you don't like it. So I think that there's a number of things that I used from the point of view of Habermas's communicative rationalities that are being really useful to me to reformulate this approach to indigenous narratives, to talk about indigenous people, and to reformulate the notion of testimonial literature. That's it.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Okay, John, writing from the Indigenous Edge, journeys into the Native American experience.
I'd like to come up here. I've got slides here in a second. Yeah, I want to do this informally. I wrote out remarks and they get pretty formal, and I end up reading and it's boring. So I just want to talk. I think that works better, at least for me. I hope for you. I looked at these two books, and we'll come back to those. But there are two Indian books I happen to be familiar with, but I've never read them, and this was an occasion for me to look at what these books did and tried to do. It so happens they're published 25 years apart. This is in the United States. And I had these questions kind of guiding my inquiry here. How did they approach the topic? How did they portray Native people? There is a long and fraught history, 400 years of colonialism and fraught relations between Euro-Americans and Native Americans in the United States. And I wanted to see ultimately how successful these two books were in exploring these cultural others and kind of pursuing intercultural understanding. One slide here on background and context. I think these are pretty much indisputable from the American experience. Most Americans know very little about Native Americans, and so they're neglected. What they do know, what most Americans do know or think they know, comes from mass media, mostly the movies. And thirdly, Native Americans, until very recently, have not had much cultural space, not much space to speak or make their own representations that are represented by others who had other motives, profit, for example. So the first book is, and chronologically, is by Kenneth Lincoln and his student, actually a graduate student named Al Slagle. Lincoln was, and still is, he's emeritus now at UCLA. He's an English professor and Native Studies professor. He, in 1975, cooked up a class to take students on the road up to the Northern Plains. And you can see a 6-year effort of several trips, held at an on-the-road seminar. And he describes it, he's not trained as a journalist and doesn't call it literary journalism, of course, but he says it's autobiographical ethnography and attempt to go home to the American heartland. He's sincere about this, and there are reasons. He is a native of Nebraska and tied in with the Lakota people there, and that helps him make this journey with his students. His quest, I say here, his journey is both personal and professional. I put in a quote there, or two quotes. It's pretty good at being reflexive. Why am I doing this? Will this work? And so he takes these students. He's got several female students, a couple of male students, including Al Slagle, who's his graduate student, who turns out to be his co-author on this. And you can see he's got this kind of, in the second quote there, this kind of vision quest idea. I want to go back for my own purposes, but I also want to take my students, and I also want to look at Native people in their own place, listen to them, and tell their stories as well. So his approach here, I call approach, is not a very technical term here, but they do immersive, experiential learning, if you want to call it that, journalism, visiting homes and reservations, and interviewing, and they do listen, and it is experiential. They hang out with Lakota people in North Dakota, South Dakota, and Nebraska, western Nebraska. He also goes beyond just reporting or telling his own story, including poems and songs and letters. He is familiar with the Lakota language and uses terms in there at various times to kind of get at things that his readers, white Americans who don't know anything about Lakota life, he uses those words as touchstones. So they do make this effort, and it's not all good news either. They do focus on some of the problems of the reservation, and one of his solutions is the ceremony, the spiritual life of Native people as a kind of way to redeem Native life on the Northern Plains. Key moment I just identified here, you can see, I call it spiritual deliverance. He is invited to a sweat lodge ceremony, and he is pretty self-aware that he's an outsider, that he maybe doesn't belong here. And so you can see his quote there. They asked me to come as a white man. He has his own misgivings, as I say. He's pretty honest about that. He is transparent, I think, on his strengths as a would-be journalist here is he's transparent. And so these quotes, so this is, I think, the sort of dramatic climax of the book. He and Al Slagle, his co-author, and I had it on the slide there, Al is part Cherokee, and it gives a more insider perspective than Kenneth Lincoln. His method here, just in terms of, he's, again, not trained as a journalist, but he does, again, in the spirit of transparency, say that they woven this into one narrative. It was a 6-year project. Started out with the students in 1975, but he and Al Slagle go back in other trips. And then it takes them 6 more years before the book comes out, so it's a 12-year process. And it's not clear when you read it when things happen. We had a discussion of time earlier today. In literary journalism, the time element is pretty warped here. You can't tell when things happen. And so it's written by 2 people, Kenneth Lincoln and his student, Al Slagle. And it's unclear whose voice, they wove it into one voice. So they do take some liberties with, if you were a New York Times reporter working for the news, political desk, you couldn't do this. There are lots of swapping around. But they are empathetic there. They do try to protect cultural and tribal knowledge, and they let others read it before they publish. I think that's one reason it takes so long. Okay, the second book, real quickly here, David Troyer, who is an Ojibwe from the Leech Lake Reservation, published much more recently, 25 years after the other. He said he's been 5 years on it. It's reporting history memoir. And he's got this question there I put on the end. He has this contradiction or ambivalence about the reservation. On one hand, there are a lot of problems on reservations that are well known. On the other hand, he and his friends and family and other tribal people he knows in Wisconsin and Minnesota love the reservation. He is more of an insider. He's writing his part of the U.A. And so he's got more of an insider's perspective. He grew up largely at Leech Lake. He's motivated in the first instance there in 2005 by this terrible shooting at Red Lake, in which a 16-year-old high school boy shot up the school and killed about 15 people. Pretty terrible, and he knows this is going to be taken by the American media as woe are the reservations, which is of course correct. So he wants to correct that impression. He does some reporting, his history, and so forth, but he also has a lot of personal stories. His brother is in it, his mother is in there, his grandfather commits suicide as a part of the narrative, independent of the book, of course, but it is a part of the tale that he tells here. So it's a much more insider perspective here. When he concludes in a way with his key moment here, a kind of his redemption is not spiritual in the same way that Lincoln had in the earlier book, but a kind of new traditionalism, I call it, still rising the Ojibwe historically harvested rice from canoes, and they still want to do this. He still says this is important. They spearfish, this is important. But they also live in the modern world. So my quote there says, basically an optimistic quote. Are things great on the reservation? Absolutely not. But are there signs of hope? Yes, there are. And one of the ways he finds redemption is the Ojibwe language, which he has a brother who became very active in preserving the language. So just to conclude here, one last slide on Troyer. He's not trained as a journalist. He's actually a novelist who went to Princeton. So he has both an insider perspective because he is Ojibwe, but he has an outsider's perspective because he went to Princeton. His mother actually went to law school, so he's not a typical Ojibwe, but he's not trained as a journalist, and he's very, he doesn't, facts are facts in Troyer's world here. And so you can see he's pretty clear about it. I didn't make up anything. I didn't invent any feelings. It's all as I saw it. I'm not sure he can live up to that, but he makes a case. So my conclusions here, both books succeed in puncturing the stereotypes surrounding Native Americans, especially the ones that are the subject of these books, in the Dakotas, Nebraska, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. It's geographically biased with that region. Both books have, it took years to write. There is an immersive element, and they have this insider-outsider. Both Troyer and Lincoln are well-educated people who can bring some critical perspective. But both books do listen and let Native people tell their own story, and both books seem scrupulously honest in terms of the real problems on the reservation. I should say that one of the problems one of the issues in Lincoln's book here, and it was a product of 1975. He took his students out. He actually has a sexual relationship with one of his students. He mentions in here, which honest of him to admit it. I wouldn't think he'd get away with that today. He also is so personal. He is searching for his own grounding in this kind of spiritual life. In that he takes his 4-year-old. He's divorced. His wife is separated, leaves the house, and leaves him with the 4-year-old. So he takes her on this trip. So he is clear that he's searching for something himself beyond his telling the story of Native people. It's for him too, and his students. You can see there, Troyer is more hard-nosed, materialistic. And then one last slide here. Both books, neither one is presented as literary journalism, but both books use the techniques in some form or other. So I think that's it. Thank you. Great.
I've been at one other journalist-related conference. I'm really impressed with journalists keeping on time. on writing Aboriginality.
Jinx me now. Right, I have a clicker. All right. First of all, I'd just like to thank the IALJS for having me here today. It's a great privilege, and I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Memoir, and also acknowledge the Australian Indigenous people of whom I am speaking today. Oh, look at that, she's technically challenged. There we go. Alright, so this is my research paper today, Writing Aboriginality, and I will be focusing on the writing of Melissa, the Walkley winner. That's my boss, making some noise over. Okay, so I think I can walk around a bit because I tend to. I've been told this was designed for theatre students, so you can hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, good. So while investigating the role of emotion and virtue in 23 Walkley winning feature articles for my PhD, it's getting edited at the moment, due to be handed in, it became really clear that journalists use literary and reporting devices in specific ways with limited degrees of success to communicate notions of Aboriginality to the Australian community. So in the 27 years that my research spans, there are only 7, and that includes one news feature, out of the 44 Walkley articles across news and feature categories, or 16% that are concerned with Indigenous issues. And within my sample of 23 articles for my time period, this does lift to 30.5%. That went backwards. Oh, hello, I need help. So, although the Walkley Awards, click for me, so there we are. There's a person who can help. Also, although the Walkley Awards have had a separate award for the coverage of Indigenous affairs since '97, in the mainstream media, Indigenous voices have been and continue to be marginalised. But despite this, the Walkleys do provide some compelling evidence of the determination of journalists to tell the untold stories of Indigenous Australians. So I argue an awareness of how these stories are heard by us, the readers, enriches our understanding of these stories that are oftentimes written physically from the remotest of the margins, only to be heard from the centre, penned by white journalists who are also from the centre. So I take it we're back, aren't we? What's that here? I'm clearly not. Oh yeah, okay. So that was just my percentages. You can see there, death was big thing. Okay, and I just wanted you to have a look at that, just to give us some context, because I can't possibly, these words just can't hold all that's happened, but look at that life expectancy, and that's probably worse because of our research techniques. Come on, you can do it, Jen. You can do it. Why is she? John, you did this before. So, alright. Alright. The subject, there we go, good. Oh, good. Let's keep that up. Thank you. And
Did you just tell me click it for you?
Up to you to click.
you show me how we click it. Oh, for goodness sakes. Alright, I didn't do that. I was down the bottom. And if I go back. Alright, so we go to here. Okay. So the subject matter of the 7 Indigenous stories, they make for really harrowing reading. And of these, only one is written by an Indigenous author. I want you just to keep these questions in mind as we go through. And I will quickly now take you through those 7 Walkley stories so you can get an idea of the content, what we're dealing with. Violence against Aboriginal women within their own community, the avoidable death of a woman from a preventable heart condition in jail, a man who killed his childhood abuser with an axe. This is our stolen generation. This is the court case, and this is petrol sniffing in a remote Indigenous community. Chloe Hooper, another Indigenous death in custody, and this is the article we're looking at today. So this is Lukashenko sinking below sight down and out in Brisbane and Logan. And she's not extractive, Pablo, in her approach, which is nice to kind of note. You'll notice the subtitle is a play on Orwell's autobiographical work, 1933, Down and Out in Paris and London. It tells the story of her decline in her own fortunes following a marriage breakup, as well as the stories of 3 women trying to survive a cycle of poverty. So in many ways, Melissa's, who is a Murray woman from Queensland, she's an embodiment of the title of this conference, From the Centre, From the Margins. As much of her career, it spans novels, essays, poetry and lectures. She has been spent navigating between the worlds of Indigenous and mainstream Australia. So through an interweaving of reporting and personal observation and experience, she exemplifies what I call the virtue of phronesis. Now that's an Aristotelian term, it's a big word, adapted by me to refer to the ability to take action on the basis of wise decisions. I won't bore you with the PhD, it'll be in an article. Her emphasis on place, combined with her construction of a narrative voice, she expresses emotions to readers, us, and constructs virtues which include responsibility, honesty, empathy, courage, and resilience. Look at me drive this baby now. Okay, so here she's calling into being what I define a particular imagined virtuous community, namely the black belt dwellers, in particular single mothers who struggle to survive. Shows the importance of not assuming that there's just one homogenous community being addressed by the journalist. So she uses the first person voice and she varies her visibility within the narrative, directing our attention to different readers away from herself, challenging us to consider the place of urban Indigenous Australians. So in this way she counters a dominant social and political discourse that the poor only have themselves to blame and that somehow Aboriginal people are the interior other. So while many readers may have been aware of this paratextual information, that she's an Indigenous writer and poet, she's a Murray woman and also has European descent, apart from one reference to my black belt peers, she doesn't elaborate on this in her article. And I think this absence reinforces the similarity between Australians. Her construction of herself as writing from within the experience of speaking to readers as one of the members of the community, this sets us apart from other articles within this Walkley section, and indeed from most articles I'd say written about Indigenous Australians. So that's why I asked you those questions, just prompted by an article by Gildersleeve in 2015, to just consider how Lukashenko's construction of herself may affect the way in which readers, us or you, hear her story by encouraging you to appreciate common connections. It's deeply informed by her habitats, her culmination of her lived experiences, and the way she moves through the fields of journalism, as well as navigating the transition from the field that was her own past life, divorce had cost her her farm, to live in one of Australia's 10 poorest urban areas. She employs a discourse of class, communicating how a person can fall into poverty. So she agrees with Orwell that it's a feeling of relief, almost of pleasure, at knowing when you are genuinely down and out. So for anyone here who's ever hit rock bottom. So she provides readers with a combination of her own graphic observation and words of the women she interviews, encouraging us to experience full empathy. For example, she recounts how this really small woman, Selma, after years of physical abuse, stood up to her partner, employing the discourse of violence and power in her words to him, warning it's strong language, but it's on the slide and it's an important part of the narrative. He didn't, he walked away, and this is one of the things that just makes this so powerful. This quote and Lukashenko's description of the violence experienced by Selma confronts us with the terrible reality of her life. And it permits us to admire her courage in standing up to her partner, challenging us to question our assumptions about society and our own imagined virtuous community, who we think we are. She writes about her first experience in a new town at the local shop with her teen, being confronted by a vomiting junkie saying, "We fell about snorting and leaping with laughter. Ah, the serenity." And the Aussies in the audience will recognise that as a reference to a much-loved film, The Castle. So this makes Lukashenko so visible to us.
3 minutes.
Thank you. We're able to experience, I don't get extra for technological faults, that they're able to experience the episode and the emotions of shock and revulsion and the relief of laughter alongside her. So just kind of think as if you know, when you read this through, where you are when you read it. She also employs humour in a construction of the lives of the 3 women, Selma, Marie and Charmaine. So her use of literary devices, they're balanced by solid reporting skills that draw upon a sociological discourse.
She gives readers context, and Dominic, I'm thinking about these figures now so differently after your talk. 9.5% of people in the greater Brisbane area officially live below the poverty line. Again, Lukashenko illustrates these facts by including her own experience, saying, as a 17-year-old caring for 3 small kids in Eagleby, I believe that nearly all Australians live like we did, with far too many animals, dying cars and bugger all disposable income. Lukashenko doesn't present readers with an overwhelmingly negative portrayal of the region, where Brisbane's Aboriginal underclass have historically concentrated. Instead, she draws upon a discourse of being poor but managing, in the process emphasising this sense of this imagined virtuous community I keep banging on about, a place where everyone mixes in together. And as one of her interviewees stated, you don't have to worry about snobs staring at you if you go to shops in bare feet. Mind you, I saw a woman in North Sydney in thongs just recently. So cold. Lukashenko's narrative is imbued with the virtues of honesty, responsibility, resilience and courage. And in turn, the experience of reading about people with these traits, I say, establishes the opportunity for us to feel virtues of compassion, empathy and sympathy towards the articles, towards the subjects of the article. By asking and answering the simple question, what dreams are possible for the Brisbane underclass in 2013, Lukashenko strengthens the sense... Was that 1 minute? Woo-hoo! I am on. Strengthens the sense of an imagined virtuous community with their readers. A notion that the only thing separating us from them are circumstances that could change any moment. So this awareness establishes the article as an example of frenetic journalism, for it transports readers successfully into a compelling narrative world, and in doing so exposes them to experiences that deepen their understanding of society. And there she is, that's in the PhD, that's what I say frenetic journalism is. Be in the article. There we go, I'm running out of time. I can read it later. And we'll just end with this wonderful quote. And I'd just like to thank you for your time. And that is Melissa Lukashenko.
So, Duncan McCue, Indigenous, Memoir, and Literary Journalism.
I feel like Bill and I are standing in between us and the President's Lodge here, so keep it quick. Berlani Onkadas Indigenous, Maingan Dodem, was Georgina Island and Lunjaba, Mishnabe and that. I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. A little bit about myself, because I think it will give some context to what I'm talking about. I've been a journalist with CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, for almost 20 years now, as a television journalist primarily, but recently a radio journalist. And I also teach a course at the University of British Columbia's Graduate School of Journalism called Reporting in Indigenous Communities. I'm here largely because of the question that Bill Reynolds asked me. He, in an effort that was mentioned to indigenize the curriculum, which is happening right across Canada now because of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Bill approached me and said, can you recommend any Indigenous literary journalism that I can discuss in my class? I said, that's a great question, Bill. Indigenous literary journalists, and it was a great question. And I couldn't really come up with many names. There were a few, which I believe now includes in this course, and one which he's going to talk about. But there were so few that I said, what's up with that? Why are there so few Indigenous writers who have taken the form of literary journalism? So what I want to do in the next couple of minutes is just kind of walk through the thinking that I had when I asked myself that question. And I'm going to talk about my own book, which is called The Shoe Boy, a Trapline Memoir. And it's my one small venture into literary journalism outside of my CBC career. The book itself I won't talk about much. There were two challenges for me. One was what anybody who writes a memoir faces. It was the challenge of recalling the story. So it's about 5 months that I spent on a tramp line with a Cree family. I'm a Ojibwe. This is a different tribe, the Cree, amongst who I lived, when I was 17 years old. And so I spent 5 months hunting and tramping with a Cree family. And the book is about that 5 months that I spent with them. So writing the memoir was a search and rescue mission in some ways. I was going back to my 17-year-old self when I was in my 40s. I don't want to talk so much about that. I think that's a typical challenge that anyone writing a memoir faces. But the second challenge for me as an Indigenous author, as an Indigenous journalist, was that it's really about deconstruction of the two-dimensional portrait of the imaginary Indian which exists in North America for the most part. And so when I think about Indigenous literary journalism and what is Indigenous voice, I have to go back into the literature itself in Canada. And historically, the Indian, the native in Canadian literature, is a pretty conventional figure. There are lots of Indians in Canadian literature, but historically, Indians had no voice. When Indigenous characters spoke, they spoke in kind of this florid, romantic, beautiful terminology, or they were speaking in kind of monosyllabic grunts. Their movements were always in relation to the white figures in literature. And so you saw the Indian as kind of a faithful friend, Tonto, sidekick, or there was the savage foe. You know, the Indians were coming over to surround the wagon trains. But their existence was always contingent upon the white person in the novel. And so, as a result, what we see historically in Canadian literature is a denial of native voice. And that all helped the colonial project, which ultimately was about land dispossession. To go into, and so when Margaret Atwood did her survey of Canadian literature in 1972, her seminal survey called Survival, there were no Indigenous authors that she commented on in Canadian literature. Fortunately, since the 70s, that started to change, and there are now many Indigenous authors who are known well in the mainstream. And so we're beginning to see indigeneity being expressed in a more full way. We're seeing how Indigenous people, their perspectives on human relationships, their perspectives on relationships with the land, their perspectives on relationships with the spirit world. When I think about journalism, sadly, many journalists in Canada have continued the same tropes that we see in Canadian literature historically. And so what we see is that Indigenous people have been certainly underrepresented in Canadian journalism. There are a lack of stories about Indigenous people and Indigenous communities. But there also have been misrepresented. And so journalists seeking the truth, have in fact, unfortunately, ended up presenting pitiful, penniless, and powerless Indigenous characters. So for me, writing Shoeboy was about getting beyond victims and warriors. And that's where I think actually my project, my small project, dovetails with some of the things that we've been talking about today. And so a couple of features that we are starting, and I hope we will be soon, analyzing Indigenous voice when it comes to literary journalism. We're going to see some key principles, and some of them have been mentioned. Pablo talked about extractive, the concerns about extraction. The way I describe it in my journalism class is that journalists have often been not storytellers, but story takers. And so for me, this is about a real family, a Cree family who are still alive. Robbie Matthews Sr. is still very much a respected elder in the Cree community. And so unlike my CBC work, I shared the text with him and his family, asked for their blessing to publish it. That was a very important part of being part of the circle for me, to share with them and to get their consent to publish this work. I think you'll see in Indigenous literary journalism that Indigenous people will be presented not as homogenous, but heterogeneous. And so for me, I'm an Ojibwe writing about the Cree community. And what you begin to see is the diversity amongst Indigenous peoples. I think you'll also begin to see, when you see Indigenous voices speaking up in literary journalism, the duality becomes not a problem, but actually embraced. And so again, when I look at my own work, what I see is splits between urban and rural, contemporary and traditional life, Indigenous spirituality and Christianity. And these aren't problematic. They're part of Indigenous life, this notion of duality. You'll also see humor showing up more and more in the representation of Indigenous people when we begin to see more Indigenous literary journalism. There's a scene in the book where I get some letters from my girlfriend after being in the bush for 4 months, having no contact. And Robbie looks over to me and smells the scented Coco Chanel that she's dabbed all over it, which was quite exciting to a 17-year-old. And he looked at me and he said, "Those videos, all the kids want to do it doggy style now." Which is not how your traditional elder typically talks. But it's a very common thing, that sense of humor amongst Indigenous people. So, last thought, do I have many more minutes left? The last thought, if I was to apply an analytical lens to the very few examples of Indigenous voice in literary journalism in Canada, if I was to think about it and analyze it through an Indigenous lens, I would use the word Debwaywen. Debwaywen is an Anishinaabe word. Roughly translates to truth. And truth is one of our 7 grandfather teachings. Important way to live as a human being, to use our grandfather teachings. Truth is one of the grandfather teachings. Unfortunately, I don't speak Anishinaabe myself. I'm learning, going to school for that. But when I think of the word Debwaywen and what it means and the teachings that go along with it, I look to the writings of Basil Johnson, who's one of a famous Anishinaabe linguist, a very wise man. And Basil looks at Debwaywen and said that when you look at the word and translate the word into what it means that truth is that a person casts, and I'll quote him, he says, casts their words and voice only as far as perception and vocabulary will enable him. So the elders often say, don't talk too much. It's a common teaching amongst our people. Don't talk too much. The point behind that is not to keep children quiet. The point behind that is to talk about things that you know. Talk about things that you know. And I think that's what Basil is getting at when it comes to Debwaywen, and I think that that's at the heart of some of what I see in David Troyer's work, for example. Talk about what you know. And when we look at truth, and in literary journalism, and that whole narrative framework, I think Debwaywen to me means that there is no absolute truth. And that the best that a speaker can achieve, and a listener can experience, is a very, very high degree of accuracy. I think if you apply Debwaywen as an analytical lens to Indigenous literary journalism, then we'll get to a very, very exciting place. Jimmy Butch.
Thank you, Duncan. Bill Reynolds, Dan David, and the political force of Indigenous literary journalism.
Not only do I have to follow one of the best voices on CBC, I'm double holding you back from the wine. Like super double whammy here. Okay, so let's just get this going. Okay, this afternoon I want to talk briefly about 2 feature stories written by Mohawk journalist Dan David. One is called Anarchy at Kanesatake, which was published in This Magazine, January 1996. He won a Canadian National Magazine Award in reporting. The other story is called All My Relations, and it was also published in This Magazine. It was written by Dan David as well. It was published November-December 1997. It also won a Canadian National Magazine Award in the category of public issues, as well as an honorable mention in the category of personal journalism. This magazine, by the way, was launched by a bunch of Toronto school activists in 1966. It was called This Magazine is About Schools. By the early 1970s, the publication evolved into a left-wing general interest magazine with strong ties to unions and union culture. By the 1990s, while still supporting unions, its focus on union issues waned when identity politics began to dominate concerns on the left, especially the next generation of activists. Its most famous editor was Naomi Klein, then a freshly minted editor of the Varsity, the University of Toronto student newspaper, and a name you may now recognize as an international activist brand. Other towers of Canadian culture over the years have included luminaries such as Michael Ondaatje and the previously mentioned Margaret Atwood, the latter of whose name continues to sit among the editors at large at this magazine. So, Dan David's stories were published in a small but very influential Canadian magazine that recently observed its half-century birthday. I suppose you might see this presentation as a case study of a particular kind of literary journalism, a very political kind. And so here's the story of Dan David's two major magazine features. David was and is primarily a broadcast journalist. He is Mohawk and was born in the United States, in Syracuse, New York. But his Mohawk mother was born on the Canadian side of the border in Kanesatake, a Mohawk territory at the confluence of the Ottawa and St. Lawrence rivers, which is about 50 kilometers west of Montreal. His Mohawk father was born on the Canadian side as well, in Akwesasne, which actually straddles both the U.S. and Canada and the two provinces of Quebec and Ontario. You can see how complicated this relation is already between, white people and Indigenous people, or the non-Indigenous and the Indigenous, and the idea of territory. The first article came about when Dan David bumped into this magazine's then editor, Clive Thompson, who some of you may recognize as a major technology feature writer based in New York. And he ran into him on the street. Dan David told Thompson about a story he had to get out of his system, a story about his home, Kanesatake. Thompson listened and then said, "Okay." That's the way Dan described it. Clive just said, "Okay." Mohawks is, why don't editors do that anymore? Mohawk society is matriarchal, yet what vexed David and a lot of people was that it was being run, or should I say overrun, in a decidedly anti-democratic manner by Jerry Peltier, the self-styled mayor for life, and his band of critters, the nickname for his thugs, who were terrorizing the community, the women, the children, getting kids hooked on dope, filming teen girls having sex with critters, the critters, not critters, and then selling the results, firing warning shots at any of the women who were trying to talk to the English police, the French police, the provincial government, the feds, all to no avail. No one would help the women. Imagine your university being run by a despot with gun-toting brown shirts driving around terrorizing everyone, firing shots through schoolroom windows. Everyone who was trying to make the area inside the campus perimeter a sanctuary space for freedom of speech and movement for everyone. And you get the idea of what was going on. Or like the Hells Angels say, setting up shop in the town hall, riding roughshod over the locals. Anarchy at Kanesatake is an angry, potent, long feature. Dan David gets at the frustration inside this world by seeing it through his older sister Linda's eyes, by looking at her calendar on the wall, for example, looking at the itemization of police intrusions, of critters' warnings, of helicopters hovering low over Mohawk land, scaring the children, a television station from Montreal trying to capture footage of pot fields on video for the 6 o'clock news. Dan David wrote Anarchy at Kanesatake to get the bile out of the system. Then his friend Don Oak, who was a senior editor at the literary journalism program at the Banff Centre, which is located inside the Banff National Park in Alberta, told him, "Dan, look, you should be able to write a story on anything you want." Oak offered Dan the chance to really go long, 10,000 words long, affording him a precious month of not thinking about anything except working through what had happened back there, behind the barricades, when David went home to Kanesatake, after the armed standoff began. Ostensibly a journalist, but these are his people. Ode's father, George, was also a Mohawk, from Oka, so Ode might have understood a bit of what David had gone through behind the barricades during the 78-day armed standoff between the Canadian government and the Mohawk Nation in the summer of 1990. Relations between the government and the Mohawk Nation have never been peachy, but there was a trigger to the standoff. The mayor of the town of Oka wanted to raise the forest above the town site, called the Pines, and bulldoze the graveyard, the Mohawk graveyard, and extend a whites-only golf course from a 9-hole to an 18-hole layout. You might venture to say the Mohawks had a point when they put the barricades up. So Dan David drove to Kanesatake from Ottawa to be with his family, his people. He writes, once in the pines, I find people from all over the territory, all ages, all families, all factions, walking around in elation, in confusion, and in fear. Most people are caught up in the euphoria of the moment. They survived the police raid and driven attackers off their land. Others just wander around aimless and dazed. A few prepare themselves in personal ways to kill or to die. There was a firefight between Mohawk warriors and Sûreté de Québec, the provincial police. It lasted 30 seconds. One police officer died. The forces of government rolled in. The Mohawks put up the barricades, expecting something, retaliation. But the second police attack never really materialized. The cops didn't swarm into Mohawk territory, but they disrupted any Mohawk wanting to leave the territory. And this is Dan David, one more shot of him. The police pull a young couple from their car, force them to strip at gunpoint in the middle of the road in front of dozens of people. Little kids in the back seats of cars cry while cops hiding behind sandbags shout insults and aim assault rifles at their parents. The police tear groceries out of people's arms and throw them into the ditch. I won't pick up a gun. I become a food smuggler instead. In terms of the Truth and Reconciliation report, which was published in 2015, Dan David said that what happened in 1990 cast a long shadow over the reconciliation and the many worthy calls to action. The next generation, he said, suffered the trauma of witnessing this brutalizing of their parents from the back seats of cars. They'd grow up wanting to have nothing to do with white authorities, nothing to do with politics, nothing to do with reconciliation. I think I already did this quick aside. We've already talked about Call to Action 86. But that was kind of why we put this together. Why stop at Canada? Why not internationalize? Back to Dan David's journalism. Note the turn of the story. I become a food smuggler instead. Thanks. Maybe David is not an objective journalist in this situation, but he sounds like a literary journalist to me. I think of John Hartsock's aesthetics of experience. Is David not examining his experience and turning it into an aesthetic exercise? It may also be therapy for Dan David to be in Banff, in one of the writing cabins, thinking about exactly how it all went down, this latest skirmish in the ongoing discord between the two civilizations. I also think a little bit of David Beer's concept of the personal reported essay. Dan David examines family history, examines the after effects of being personally involved with people behind the barricades, and of dealing with sleep-deprived, bitter, armed people on both sides of the conflict. And he reports, and he reports, and he reports. He puts his own boots on the ground. I also think of Wolf's idea of saturation reporting from inside a subculture. Dan David used his sister's testimony as an entree into the nightmare rule that had engulfed Kanesatake to write his anarchy story, and his reporting skills to ferret out the rest of the information. For all my relations, David himself was the agent inside the subculture, showing us a world we may not have otherwise ever known, at least in such personal terms. The eye-opening part of the story is the fact that, despite the perception from the outside that David must have been in the tank for the Mohawks, He couldn't find work with CBC after he left Kanesatake on the subject, even though he had the experience and the knowledge. He neatly skewers the posturing and double dealing going on inside the barricades as well, which speaks to what John was saying earlier about being able to criticize. In Banff, David had gotten the bile of the system with the anarchy story, and now Don Oak was encouraging Dan to be more reflective, take a longer look at history, the history of his family in particular, looking back and then looking forward. After all, it was his great-grandfather who was one of the souls buried in the pines. It was his great-grandfather who had stood up to the Canadian government. And it was his great-grandfather who sailed to New England to get an audience with King Edward VII. He wanted action. The seminary of St. Sulpice and the federal government, the Federal Department of Indian Affairs were conspiring to take away more Mohawk land. Dan David writes, "For the seminary to have a clear title to the land, the Mohawks must go. This suits the department just fine since it has embarked on an inflexibility policy of assimilation. In the words of the poet, the bureaucrat, the deputy superintendent of Indian Affairs, Duncan Campbell Scott, the aim is to remove every vestige of Indianness from the Indian until there are no more Indians and no more Indian problem." Dan David had a lot to mull over in his story, All My Relations, including an echo of his great-grandfather's visit to England when David himself was given a Commonwealth Fellowship, and so he traveled over to England. I asked Dan David why he hadn't written any features lately. He told me those were the stories he had to get out of his system. Once those stories were out, life took over. He went to South Africa in the 1990s and helped in the satisfying work of evolving the South African Broadcast Corporation from state control to public broadcasting. He said it was a lot more satisfying than living through the Oka crisis. Then the 2000s came along and more broadcast work here and there, and now we're into 2017. And strangely enough, he said that lately, this past winter, he had been thinking of going back to writing at feature length. I hope he does.
Well, very impressive talks, all on time. So we have the full 20 minutes for questions. And just to encourage questions, I'll say that the reception is going to be nice, but really quite modest.
I feel privileged to have been here today at this session, and I think I can speak for all of us. I was moved, touched, and disgusted. And so this shows the power of your messages. My question is to the panel: how much of this isn't ethnography, and how much of this isn't also some sort of public service? These revelations and this knowledge that your literary journalists and yourselves are doing. Thank you. Anyway.
I might say on that David Troyer's book, he's pretty clear that he's a novelist, he's a successful novelist before he wrote this book, and he is so disturbed that that Red Lake massacre that I mentioned, that we're going to get the Seminole media coverage, the poor Indian on the reservations, assault, drugs, alcohol, and abuse. And he wants to tell a different story, so he's very clear in his purposes. I want to set the record straight, tell the story of reservation life from the native point of view, and let he interviews and spends time with people and lets them talk. And he says in there, I think I skipped over it on a slide, that he doesn't have a journalistic problem with having those people approve how they're quoted, so he goes back to those people to try to be authentic. I want to tell this story from this point of view, the Ojibwe point of view, and as I said, mostly Minnesota, also in Wisconsin, but he has a clear purpose of telling a different story. Let's change the narrative. So in a sense, that's his public service. He complains, he says, I did find YouTube, he he's gotten publicity on this book. It was at the National Book Festival in Washington, D.C. I happened to find a Book TV interview with him, and he says, I was complaining to my editor and my friends about the bad publicity that reservations get, and that's not my story. That's not the story. It's not my experience. And somebody should write a book about it. And then, as editors, I'm looking at it. You should write the book. And so I think there was a clear public service idea that he had.
Any other views?
So, on a personal level, when I wrote the piece for The Believer, I sat down with Manari, and it's there are 400, there were 200,000 in the early 20th century, and in their view of the world, they are going to their gods have told them that when they see the first white man, their culture is doomed, so they have to prepare for extinction. So that's something that they had in mind, and they wanted to protect the land because they believe that when they die, their souls go to the plants and the animals of the land. So it's not for them, for their livelihood, but for as a sanctuary for their souls, right? So to me, that was immediately like a very sad story. But I sat down with him, and one thing I learned is that he said, like, I don't want you to write a sad story about it. I want you to write something that is that shows how beautiful our lives were and are. So I don't know if that. I don't know. We have several contracts when we engage in journalism, ethnography, and sociology, right? They are deontological contracts and professional contracts. I don't know to what extent you sit down with the source and the source tells you, well, this is the tone, and you modulate your story according to the tone that you read to discuss with the source. That's why I think that in several instances, I'm not sure that journalism works to tell these types of narratives with the appropriate, the contextual approach to the culture. I don't know if that answers the question.
I was just going to add to that. I think when I talk about frenetic journalism, and I certainly think this is what Melissa's doing, is when you transport it into that story and it gives you that opportunity to change, to then go out to the community. So I would say two very overused words in my thesis: crucial, so important, as a public service, very much.
And I'll tackle the public service component. There's been mention of Call to Action 86, which to refresh memories, deals with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the residential schools. Call to Action 86 says that journalism schools have a duty, responsibility to teach Indigenous history, culture, and politics to journalism students. That very much was a recognition that reconciliation, if it's at all possible, journalists are not arm's length from that project of reconciliation, but are very much part of it. They have to be part of it. It's the way that if reconciliation is to happen in Canada or any of the other states in this world, then journalists will be part of it and will need to reform and reconcile themselves. It is very much a public service.
No? Oh, I was just going to say about my reading of Dan David is that he is a hardcore journalist. So those two features that I chose to talk to you about, they strike me as being imbued with such personal intensity, because he knows it's his home, and it's his people, and it's his family, and he's totally affected by it, but he's not so affected by it that he can't do his journalism. I really get that sense out of him. And talking to him, I had an hour-long interview with him. Yeah, I mean, I think Duncan knows Dan a little bit. That's my reading of Dan. That whatever else he is a reporter, a journalist. Bottom line, you know, it just so happens that from a literary journalism point of view, he's got this one area of expertise, journalism, and then he's got this other area of expertise, which is his Mohawk upbringing, and that intersects with, you know, the crisis at Oka. So he's in a pretty good position to, if he can maintain his journalistic skills in it, to tell powerful stories.
So along those lines, specifically for Duncan and Pablo, I'm curious, when you went back to be a storyteller instead of a story taker, and you went to not just extract, but to have a more dialogical process with the people that you're writing about. Were there times where, I don't want to say sources because it doesn't really seem like equivalent here, but were there times when the people that you were writing about had a disagreement about the way that you wrote it, or felt that maybe it wasn't exactly accurately presented, or perhaps you felt, you know, you needed to perhaps show a side that was less, I suppose, that may have taken a shine off of something, right? And they may not have felt as comfortable with that. Were there times that they sort of said, I disagree, or I don't feel comfortable, and how did you negotiate that?
For me, it's against our journalistic standards and practices at the CDC to share a story with the source for all kinds of obvious reasons. So for me, it was quite a step to share the manuscript with my sources, and I was terribly fearful that I would get into that negotiation with them because I deal with drunkenness in the family, suicide. There are all kinds of, the difficulty that Robbie has in terms of Robbie Matthews Sr., the elder, in terms of trying to hold on to his Cree culture and pass it on to his children. There's all kinds of difficult subject matter. It's also a memoir, and it's written from my perspective. The title of the book is The Shoe Boy, which is what Robbie called me because I was in many ways a fish out of water. I was an urban Ojibwe kid amongst a bunch of Cree trappers who were speaking Cree as their first language. So I think he understood that it was my perspective on an event a long time ago. And he wrote back and said, well, his son wrote back on Facebook, and said, you have our blessing, that was it. There was no negotiation. It was my truth, and I think Robbie recognized that. It's not his truth. But there was no negotiation.
I think I was a channel for a story, so that story was vested in me as a channel. And yeah, I wouldn't say negotiation, but everything I wrote, I talked about him or about other sources I discussed with them. And in instances, like for instance, Manari comes one day, well, I was talking to my dad last night, and well, his dad's been dead for 20 years, so it's a difficult. He's coming from a place that my notion of reality would not accept, right? So I have to suspend some notions in order to give credit to what he's telling me. And I try. I don't assume that he's. I mean, there's a contract of trust to a certain extent, and also I need to check and fact check. But there's stuff that that is not checkable. Like, I had to deal with my fact checkers. That's 2 rounds of fact checking. Very intense. I believe it's very difficult in that sense. We talked about fact checking, I think, last year, so it was a problem with the fact checking too.
So we have a question here, and then a question over in that corner.
I have a question about human subject review board or institutional review board. And it seems like immediately there's some gray areas here. If you approach this as a journalist, you don't think about this quite so much. You're not bound by those rules. But if you approach it as an academic, then I think you are, I assume you are bound by those rules. And at least in the States, I know that all the tribes have a nation-to-nation agreement with the United States. So that negotiation would have to go with individual tribes, I assume. I don't know how it is in Canada, but could you just talk about sort of the gray area or the ethics or the issues of institutional review for the kind of work that you're doing if it involves personal contact?
If I could give a small example, I teach a course called Reporting in Indigenous Communities. It was essential, and so I send my journalism students, most of them are non-native, out into the communities to report, not literary journalism, they publish 1,000-word multimedia articles. But it was essential to me in setting up the course that I established partnerships with the First Nation communities that we were going to be sending students into. That wasn't something that the school asked me to do, or the university asked me to do. It was something that I needed to do as an Indigenous scholar. And so all of the communities became our partners, which is an unusual relationship for a bunch of journalism students to be in. What I was concerned about was that they would ask for veto power over our stories.
Right.
And that would be a deal breaker, going back to that question about journalistic standards and policies. None of the communities did. None of them did. And so, but that's about building relationships. And I had a relationship with all of those communities prior as a journalist. But I think it was an essential step, and I wouldn't have taught the course if we didn't have those partnerships.
Any other views on the panel on that issue? Please.
Jennifer, I was noticing your comparison with Orwell sort of reminded me that when he was doing Down and Out comparison, when he actually had his wealthy aunt who he could go and visit, so he had an out. And so I was sort of thinking about your example of someone who doesn't have that out, and actually one of the things that I was sort of questions that I wanted to ask that was sort of begged by the extracts you gave us was how does she make her journey out of that situation, and sort of following on from that, thinking about my students who write memoirs and often it's from a place of safety, so that they've left and they can look back because they have enough sort of psychological distance. So I was just wondering if you wanted to speak to that.
I think one of the things that is imbued and a very important thread in Melissa's story is how there are ways out. Okay, so the women that she talks about, you know, that they start going to school, they get an education, they start saving some money. These are things that you can't fit into the sort of 10 minutes. But also too, Melissa, you know, she's an educated woman, she's a writer, she was living in Byron Bay, beautiful part of the country with her husband, raising Arabian horses. The marriage broke up, and you know, she'd gone back to that country because it was her mother's and her grandmother's country. So she came in equipped with, you know, she already had, you know, education skills, but what actually got her out of it, she went on, there is a quiz show in Australia called How to Be a Millionaire. Yeah, so she actually went on that and she won, you know, $50,000. And yeah, that's how she got out of it. Yeah, so that's not quite in that story. And what she also doesn't tell you in that story with respect to the privacy of her daughter, she mentions that, you know, she has her teenage child with her going through troubles, but her teenager had tried to commit suicide, which was another, you know, terrible thing. The farm life had fallen apart, they have no money, she's there, and it's this caring for this child. And there's another beautiful recounting she does of when she goes on this quiz show and wins, and, you know, the child was saying, we did it, we get out. And that's how that, so education, luck, you know, and I think too, she wrote her way out of that. And if you read the article, these women, you know, were learning their way out of that. They knew what they had to do. With that,
Oh, this ought to be the last question. In the context of talking about reconciliation, I think the key point might be about forgiveness. How do we use language or create language that talks about forgiveness in a way that is meaningful and has some real depth to it?
Why forgiveness?
Why forgiveness? Or reparation would be a better word.
Well, forgiveness or healing, I think those seem to be maybe I'm wrong, they seem to be essential to the reconciliation process. I'm trying to get at how we can have that conversation in a way that doesn't sound like a Hallmark card. How do you get the forgiveness that has real depth and meaning to it?
My limited understanding of this so far, as we started on this project at Ryerson, is we got a long way to go. We don't even know how far we have to go. I mean, it's unbelievable. When you start actually thinking about this, and you think about how you're going to inculcate these values, how you're going to change people, how you're going to make people forget about wrongs, it's going to take generations. But you have to start somewhere. That's the thing. And that's what I kind of like about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, is that they actually put in that call to action 86. And it's like, you, journalism school, get up off your ass and start doing something. You know, you guys are educating our kids, okay? So they're smart kids, they can pick it up. You know, and so it sort of feels like once you feel that thunderbolt, you realize you have to change.
One of my colleagues is writing a book on forgiveness, and it opens, I've forgiven everyone who's ever harmed me, but I do remember the time and the place.
Well, and so that echoes what I was going to say, because when you say forgiveness in the context of reconciliation, I think there's a compulsion to forgive and forget.
Yes.
And reconciliation is not about forgiveness and forgetting. Reconciliation is about remembering and changing.
Thank you.
Panel, great way to wrap up the day, really quite profound. And so it was spontaneous, but join me once again in thanking the panel. Now it's time for some refreshments. All right. See you all very soon.